Good evening, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Lionel Howard, and I'm Associate Professor of Educational Research here at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, and I'm also serving as tonight's co-host for our presentation this evening.
And hi, everyone. I'm Amanda, AKA Mandy, for those folks in here who know me a while, Taylor. I use she and hers pronouns, and I am a faculty member in the School of International Service at American University, as well as our Assistant Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at AU. And we are so happy to co-sponsor this event with our good colleagues at GW and our incredible speakers, Mark and Jonathan. Thanks to all who are here. Thanks to our AU folks who are part of this group, and to our GW colleagues down the road. We're happy to be in collaboration and community with you tonight.
Thank you, Mandy. It's always to be in community with you, and welcome AU community as well. Just a quick couple of housekeeping issues. If you would like to access the live captioning, you can set the feature by clicking on the More option at the bottom panel of your Zoom. Within that option, you'll see the option to hide or to make visible the subtitles. You can click on that and you should be able to see the live captioning. So let me first start by welcoming everyone to our first presentation of the Education and Inequality Cross-Disciplinary Research Concentrations 2022 Research Colloquium. We are excited to co-host with American University Mark Warren and Jonathan Stith, and to welcome them back to the GW and the GSHED community. For those not familiar with the Education and Inequality concentration of the PhD in Education program, as a scholarly community, we investigate the intersection of power, race, place, and identity as key areas informing considerations of education and inequality. A central focus of our concentration is to understand the intersections of communities, families, schools, service providers, and children as a part of the larger society and the world in which they exist. Through our scholarly activity, we search for ways to create opportunities for understanding, disrupting, and dismantling systems of oppression that have adversely and disproportionately affected the lives of marginalized, minoritized, immigrant, migrant, and BIPOC student populations. So it is most fitting to learn and to be in conversation with Mark and Jonathan this evening. Our guest, Mark Warren, is a professor of public policy and public affairs at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And he is the author of several books, but his newest book is Willful Defiance, The Movement to Dismantle the School to Prison Pipeline. Mark is a sociologist, and he studies and works with communities and youth organizing groups seeking to promote equity and justice in education, community development, and civic engagement. Mark will be in conversation with Jonathan Stith, who is the director of the Alliance for Educational Justice and co-director of the National Campaign for Police-Free Schools. He is a leading national voice working tirelessly in service of and along with communities and groups that have been subject to and working to address inequalities within the context of education and other social issues and systems. And notably, Jonathan is a Washingtonian. In this co-presentation format, Mark will begin by discussing the history of the movement, illustrating how Black and Brown parents and students organized locally to challenge racist school discipline policies and policing practices, and built a national movement within the power to begin to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. Jonathan will then lift us up with stories and lessons of the movement that connect the police-free schools movement today, highlighting the role of young people at the forefront of efforts to transform schools towards authentic education and liberation. So it is my pleasure to welcome both Mark and Jonathan.
Great. Well, thank you, Lionel, and thank you, Mandy, for inviting us here to share some of our work with you tonight. I'm going to be talking about the book Willful Defiance, the movement to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline in a few minutes. That book, I am what I would call a community engaged scholar or an activist scholar. So I've been studying the history and current reality of this movement for many years, but I do that in deep partnership with the parent and youth organizing groups and national alliances that are doing this work on the ground. And Jonathan is one of my very close partners in this work. Another partner has been a group called the Sacramento Area Youth Speaks organization, and young people there wanted to express their voice and their views on the school to prison pipeline in association with this book, because we believe that their books are important, but there are multiple ways to really express voice and engage communities in conversation around this issue. So we're going to start with, it's about a 5-minute video. I think you will find it very powerful and compelling, and then I'll come back and do my presentation. So thank you.
They don't care if our babies thrive at school, long as they get by at school. Get by institutionalized racism and intergenerational oppression systems that keep prison pipelines thriving. Disguised as willful defiance, I'm trying to understand why urban schools have the highest rates of incarceration instead of culturally relevant curriculum that should be liberation. Suspensions from school feel like eternity. Strategically guide the Black and brown kids out when we truly come to school to get free. Stifle academic and social emotional education. I'm just saying, could this be racially motivated? Outcomes being primarily Black and brown youth become academically stagnated, leading to suspensions, expulsions, less school participation, stereotypes perpetuated. Is your school pedagogy, discipline, or human elevation? Discipline data from the Department of Education found that Black girls are 5 times more likely than white girls to be suspended at least once from school. This data infuriated when Black girls are 7 times more likely to receive multiple out-of-school suspensions. Where is the healing, motivation, and rebuilding? How can we stand in our confidence after it's been disciplined away? How do I come to school ready to learn when you are trying to strip my intelligence and make it seem like I am insane? Black girls are 3 times more likely to receive referrals to law enforcement when white girls are getting away with behaving the same way. And we already know what they are doing to Black and brown boys. It's insane. Just check the data. It's been staying the same. I mean, steady increasing is definitely a shame. Do we want to teach Black boys, or do we want to lead them away to trajectories that don't lead to school or higher education degrees? Schools act like they are paid to lead them to the police when it's supposed to be a safe haven to keep youth off the streets. Expand opportunities, increase chances to succeed. Shouldn't school be focused on how to keep young people engaged and excited to be in their seats? Stop mistaking our pride for reasons for us to collide with suspensions, infractions, eventually leading to the police. We try to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. It's definitely time for us to get free. Who their students are and the environment they are living in. What students have to go through when they go home and live through before they can make it back to school again. Have you taken the time out to comprehend the life experiences of the children you are teaching and how your experience greatly differs from them? We have to remember school can empower or be a major hindrance. Is your school pushing towards prison or the most beautiful existence? The difference is we fight for educational justice. Trust us, we won't stop until our babies get free. Educational liberation means we have to fight for what we believe. You can't suspend the truth out of our youth. You can't expel a generation that's meant to prevail. We demand an education where we can be more than our ancestors' wildest dreams. We want to go to school and truly be free.
Can somebody explain to me why, as soon as we enter the room, the teacher says bye-bye? We're not getting paid unfortunately, hand down and kicked out of school for throwing attention captured, sent out on Zoom for sending messages. Pipe down, little black girl, you're too domineering. Pushed out, harshly disciplined, over criminalized, school not made for a black girl to shine. Can somebody explain to me why all my beautiful black and brown faces sitting in courtrooms over classrooms, juvenile offenders, minor underage, facing life rather than graduating? Something is wrong with this country's education. We losing our babies, perpetuating racism in a system that's not set up for us to win. And parents don't send their kids to school, we criminalize them. It's clear to me education is not for liberation, it's for disciplining. Can somebody explain to me why officer on campus arresting teens, placing minor in custody? It's a shame we live in a nation that doesn't invest in education. Can somebody explain to me why being black in school is a crime? My skin not willfully defiant, it's just a dirty trap to keep us trapped in the school to prison pipeline.
Okay, well, thank you, Lionel. Broke up a little bit, but I hope you got a feeling for the power of that piece. I'm just going to try to share my screen if I can here. Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk for probably about 20 minutes and try to give you an overview of the book, and in that sense, an overview of the movement and some of what I found in doing this kind of research that I've done, as I said, in partnership with the parent and youth organizing groups that are doing this work across the country. The book tries to lift up the stories of parents and young people who both have been the victims, if you will, of the school to prison pipeline, but have also become organizers in their community to change things. And so I start with the story of Zakia Sakari Jabbar. She was a working single mom at the time. She went back to college and she put her African-American son, Amir, in preschool. And this is what she said, quote, "The problems began right away. The preschool gave me a hard time enrolling him in the first place. Then in the first week, I started receiving phone calls telling me, quote, he had a temper tantrum. He's not wanting to transition from one activity to another. Is that not normal?" I replied. "Is that not something that your teachers can deal with?" Then the preschool asked me to have Amir evaluated. Evaluated for what? It was as if he was a guinea pig. They made normal 3-year-old behavior sound very pathologized and abnormal. And I realize now that I don't think we were ever really wanted there. Zakia refused to have her son evaluated, and the preschool suspended him multiple times and then eventually expelled him. He was suspended and expelled from several other preschools, and eventually Zakia had to drop out of college in order to take care of him. But before she did, she went to the college library and did a literature search on Black boys in education. And she also started talking with other Black parents in the Dayton, Ohio area where she was. And she found that her son's experience was not unique. So many Black parents and children were having the same experience. And she met with these folks in living rooms across the city. And together with Vernelia Randall, she formed an organization called Racial Justice Now. And they began to organize African-American parents to challenge the discipline policies in the school system. She got support. They joined the National Dignity in Schools campaign and got support from the national movement for the work that they were doing. In a few years, they had some incredible victories. They won a moratorium on pre-K suspensions in Dayton, Ohio schools. They changed the school district's code of conduct to end zero tolerance policies. They won the implementation of restorative justice in 10 schools, and they issued school discipline report cards for school districts across Ohio. Despite all of these victories, when I interviewed Zakia, she ended the interview with this, reflecting on really the depth of systemic racism in our system. And she said, "My son Amir is in 4th grade now, And this school year has been one of the most difficult. No matter what I do, I can't make the teacher see us differently. I can't make her love Amir. I can't make her see him as an energetic 9-year-old boy who has some leadership qualities that she could cultivate instead of viewing him as a menace or a nuisance. I can't make a teacher love my son. Oops. Looks like I'm not able to, I'm gonna have to stop sharing and reshare the screen, I think, again. Sorry about that. Great. I titled the book Willful Defiance because people may not realize this, but school districts suspend hundreds of thousands of students every year for something called willful defiance. And here it is stated as a reason for suspension by the California Education Code. Disrupting school activities or otherwise willfully defying the authority of supervisors, teachers, administrators, school officials, or other school personnel engaged in the performance of their duties. Starting in the 1990s, state after state passed laws granting local school districts the authority to punish students for this kind of reason. Mississippi schools suspend students for, quote, disruptive behavior, and Louisiana for, quote, willful disobedience. In South Carolina, it is called disturbing school, and for many years was caused not just for suspension, but criminal penalty. So was acting in an obnoxious manner. In a widely publicized case, which is in the bottom corner here, a white school resource officer was called into a classroom because a Black girl student refused to give up her cell phone. She said she didn't actually have a cell phone. The officer grabbed her out of the chair, slammed her to the floor, and dragged her across the room. And Nia Kenny, who's pictured in the right, took a video of this, which went viral. And in the end, although the officer lost his job, he was never charged with anything, but Shakara and Nia were both charged with criminal disrupting school, a criminal charge. And there had to be an organizing campaign, which Jonathan, who's here with us today, was part of, in order to get the department to drop the charges against her. South Dakota bans boisterous behavior, while Arkansas prohibits, quote, annoying conduct. Maine makes interrupting a teacher by speaking loudly a civil offense, punishable by a $500 fine. But by calling the book Willful Defiance, we were trying to flip the script. Because if a system is set up to punish, control, and criminalize young people, then they should willfully defy it. But when individual students or parents try to stand up and challenge this on their own, they in fact are often punished or arrested. And so this is really a book and a movement about people coming together, Black and brown students and parents, to willfully defy this system together. Still having trouble with the my PowerPoint here, so I apologize. Let me try one more time.
Mark, if you click the bottom arrow, does that work? On your screen, there should be a bottom arrow.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, that works. Thank you very much. So I start with the story of Zakiya and with the quotes about willful defiance, because I think they reflect the key themes of the book. How did small under-resourced community organizing groups like Racial Justice Now in places like Dayton change education discourse away from zero tolerance, change policy and practice in localities like Dayton and across the country? And the two pieces that I lift up primarily in the book is, first, the vital importance of people who are most impacted by educational injustice, that is students of color and families of color being at the center of the movement, their voices, their participation, and their leadership really driving the movement forward. And secondly, a combination of that kind of deep organizing with the resources that come from a national movement. But a national movement embodied by organizations like the Alliance for Educational Justice, with Jonathan here today, and also the Dignity in Schools campaign, but national organizations that are not dominated by professional advocates in Washington and focused solely on federal policy, but national organizations that are really directed at supporting, spreading, and what I call, following G2 Brown, nationalizing local struggles. But I also, and I want to come back to this, I start with a quotation from Zakiya because it also, I think, signals just how deep and enduring systemic racism is in our system. And despite the policy changes that have occurred, which I'll talk about in the movement, which have really been incredible, at the same time, facing the situation that we really need a really deep transformative change in the hearts and minds of educators and systems in our schools. As she says in the end, all this doesn't matter if I can't really reach our teachers and see us as human beings. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this. I can talk about more in the conversation. I talk about this. I am doing this project as a community engaged scholar. Several roots led me to my interest in this project, and I'll mention one. When I was at Harvard University and working with Mandy Taylor, who's here, we had a group of 17 students and Karen Mapp, and when we studied community organizing efforts at educational reform across the country. And Mandy was part of that project, and we produced a book called A Match on Dry Grass. And when we did that project, we really looked at organizing groups really as local phenomena, really in a box in their locality. And at the time that we started the project, which was about 2008, that was largely true. It was a reflection of what was happening in the world of community organizing. But by the time the book came out in 2012, things had really started to change. And we had started to see the coming together of local organizing groups across the country and forming national organizations and a national movement for educational justice. And to me, the school to prison pipeline movement was really the cutting edge of that. It was really where we first saw organizations come together. And what we began to realize is that the forces that local organizing groups were facing, both with the school to prison pipeline and with neoliberal reforms like the mass closings of schools in Black and brown communities, could not be fought solely locally. That local organizations, particularly those who were small and under-resourced and led by parents and young people of color, could not fully build the power they needed working alone solely locally. They needed to come together across the country to combine their resources, to lift up and support each other's struggles, and to learn from those struggles and to be inspired. And the role of the national organizations was really to, in a sense, lift up and nationalize these local struggles and spread them across the country. So I became interested in this, in trying to understand, document, and analyze how is it that the movement to challenge the school to prison pipeline was built and has had some of the effects that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Again, I can talk a little bit more about this in our discussion. I don't want to get too deep into how the school to prison pipeline operates, but I wanted to point out that what I think is that it really arose in the 1990s in conjunction with and as part of the larger system that Michelle Alexander has described as the new Jim Crow. So as the gains of the civil rights movement occurred, as desegregation in public education occurred, there was also a move to a new form of punishment and control and a system of mass incarceration. And actually the term zero tolerance arose in the war on drugs, and it was transferred from the war on drugs and criminal justice systems in the community to schools. And schools across the country, school districts in the 1990s started to adopt zero tolerance school discipline policies and to bring police into schools. So in the 1970s, in the entire country, there were only 100 police officers total in US schools. By the early 2000s, there were 15,000 police officers in schools, and the number has only grown since then. And what I try to argue in the book, which I think is less well known, is that really the system of mass incarceration starts in school. That many studies are now starting to show that young people in juvenile justice and criminal justice systems had their first encounters with police in school. We have 250,000 students are referred to law enforcement out of schools every year. And it's really an intergenerational transmission of criminalization. It's not really well known, but a quarter of Black children by the age of 14, fully a quarter of Black children will have had a parent in prison at some point. So it's really a system that is incarcerating parents and then setting young people on the road to prison out of our school systems. So let me come back to the history of the movement. So I was mentioning that it started that the school to prison pipeline really got going in the 1990s. And really at the same time, so did the movement to start to challenge it. And that movement, the first people who were to name the school to prison pipeline and challenge it were not scholars like myself. They were not professional advocates or civil rights advocates based in Washington or anywhere else. They were parents and young people in places like Holmes County, Mississippi, in the heart of the Mississippi Delta and the old slave system. And I went to Holmes County to find some of the earliest origins of the movement. And in the mid-1990s, Helen Johnson, who you see here, and Ellen Reddy, her sister, were Black community organizers in Holmes County. At the time, I think possibly the poorest county in the country. And they were seeing young people out on the streets during the school day. And they started to ask them, well, why are you out on the street? And they would say things like, well, you know, a teacher told me to leave school. I didn't take off my hat. And, you know, they told me to go home. And they started to find out that many of these students were being referred to the juvenile justice system. And in one famous case, there was a group of Black children on a school bus throwing popcorn at each other. And popcorn hit the back of the white school bus driver, and she drove the bus straight to the police station. And 7 African-American boys were arrested and charged with criminal assault for throwing a piece of popcorn that hit the back of a school bus driver. That was one of their very first organizing campaigns, was to get charges dropped against these students. But by the time they were dropped, they lost their transportation systems and they ended up failing to graduate from high school. But at the time, these organizers and parents and young people called it the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. And they launched a campaign called the Prevention of Schoolhouse to Jailhouse. And they tried to end the referrals of students to juvenile justice and also close down training schools, which were juvenile justice detention facilities, were actually jails, which were horribly abusing young people. And I don't even want to get into hog tying and beating and sexual assaults that were happening to Black children in those schools and in those facilities. So I think it's vitally important for us to understand that it really was people who were most impacted by injustice who were the people to first name it and challenge it. And we wouldn't really have had a movement. We would probably not have even heard the term school to prison pipeline if it wasn't for the organizing efforts of people in places like Holmes County. And then in the book, I tried to chart the development of the movement and go to different parts of the country and look at how it wasn't just in Mississippi, but it was also in places like South Los Angeles, where a group of Black and brown parents called Cadre got together and launched a campaign in the early 2000s to challenge zero tolerance school discipline policies. And in 2007, they won the first victory when they were the grassroots effort behind getting the Los Angeles district to adopt school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports as an alternative to suspensions and expulsions. And I talk about and show how that victory in Los Angeles really reverberated around the country and then inspired this kind of nascent movement to get going in other kinds of places. And it was really the impetus for the formation of the National Dignity in Schools campaign. And at that time, in around 2008, which is about the time that the Alliance for Educational Justice formed, zero tolerance was the law of the land. Both national teachers unions had official positions in favor of zero tolerance discipline. All of the national education associations were in favor of, had official positions in favor of zero tolerance. It was the position of the federal government. It was enshrined in state law and school districts across the country. And when parents and young people first said that we're going to challenge this and we're going to end zero tolerance, they were told they were crazy for even trying to do this. So I chart how this very first victory in Los Angeles was then nationalized, forming the Dignity in Schools campaign that then started to gather resources that were then brought back down to local organizing campaigns, model codes of conduct, research, training resources, and other things. And I go to Denver in the bottom left corner, where a group of Latinx young people in an organization called Padres and Jóvenes Unidos started organizing and actually won the first district-wide end to zero tolerance in the implementation of restorative justice programs. They were also one of the first to challenge policing practices in schools, and how those and also brought their campaigns to the state level. And then I go to Chicago, where a group of young people in an organization called Voice campaign for at the state level for Senate Bill 100, SB 100 here. You can see some of the young people in that picture. They were frustrated with trying to make changes at the local level in Chicago, and they had learned from meeting young people across the country in what were called action camps about state level campaigns to do this work. And so they became the grassroots force behind passage of SB 100, which was at the time the strongest and most progressive law in the country that sought to end zero tolerance school discipline policies. And this was, of course, a group of young people who themselves weren't old enough to vote and had to travel 3 hours on a bus every week down to the state capitol to make their case for their views and for the policy that they had written. So in any case, I talk here about this kind of dynamic between national and local, and this is a quotation from Joyce Parker from Mississippi Delta. There is no national without the local, really constantly trying to ground the national movement in accountability to the organizing that was happening locally. As the movement gained force, it started to emerge as quite a complex, diverse movement, and try to look at how parents and young people struggle to build solidarity with each other from their somewhat different perspectives, to build an intergenerational movement. It also emerged as an intersectional movement, trying to deal with the tension between how do you create a movement in which Black girls, girls of color, and gender nonconforming students can assert their particular issues, the particular ways that the school to prison pipeline affects them and their particular policy proposals, to do that at the same time that it doesn't take a focus away from the way that the school to prison pipeline criminalizes Black and brown boys, and also try to document the emergence of the police-free schools movement. So, you know, in 2020, when mass protests against police violence and police racism emerged, some cities swept through with proposals to defund and remove police from schools. What most people don't know is that the places that where these victories occurred at first were really places that organizing groups have been organizing to remove police from schools for many years. And in 2012, the Black Organizing Project in Oakland declared the goal of removing police entirely from schools within 10 years. Once again, they were told they were crazy for advocating that position. It was never going to happen. By 2022, all police had been removed from Oakland schools. So these were places like Oakland where organizing groups have been doing work, building leadership, doing political education, doing research, presenting proposals to remove or defund police, building relationships with policymakers, doing all of the organizing work that it takes to really create policy change. And then when the mass protests occurred in 2020, they were ready to ride that wave and actually create initial changes in winning the removal of police from schools. I don't have all time to go into all of this, but let me say that, as I mentioned, in 2008, zero tolerance was the law of the land. By 2014, the federal government under President Obama, in response to the movement organizing, issued new guidance warning away from the school to prison pipeline and against racist school discipline policies. And really, by 2014 and 15 or 16, zero tolerance had been defeated in education discourse. So within 6 or 7 years of the emergence of the movement nationally, there were also a rolling series of victories at local and state levels. And as a result, some significant reductions in suspensions, expulsions, especially in places where organizing was strong, So in Los Angeles, in 2007 and 8, 75,000 days of instruction were lost due to suspensions and through suspensions. A coalition of organizing groups won a school climate bill of rights that banned suspending students for willful defiance. And as a result, by 2016 and 17, the number of days lost of instruction had fallen from 75,000 to 5,600. So really dramatic declines. And as I mentioned, the beginnings, I would say, to defund or remove police from schools. Nevertheless, there's a lot of enduring challenges. Even though suspensions have fallen, the racial disparities within them have not budged. Black students are still 3 times more likely to be receiving out of school suspension than white students. We still have the persistence of police and policing practices. And in fact, I think if anything, and we're going to be talking a lot more about this in the discussion, I think we understand even more now just how deeply policing practices and criminalization is embedded in our schools and school systems. And finally, the need to create really authentic alternatives that seek to transform the culture and practice of education in our schools. So it's not enough to end discipline practices. It's not enough to remove police from schools. We really need a wholesale transformation of what's happening in our school systems. So I just want to end on that note. We talk about school discipline policies, and we talk about policing, and in some ways they're at the heart of the school to prison pipeline. But really, the school to prison pipeline is a result of a whole series of factors that aren't just about discipline and policing. They're about the underfunding of our schools, culturally irrelevant curriculum, outdated facilities, less qualified and less certified teachers in these schools, and schools that are not really rooted in and connected to the communities and have not really built, collaborative and partnerships with students and families. And so, we talk, I think, more about, we used to talk about public education being based upon white supremacy. Today, that's a much more public conversation. But if that's true, what will it really take to transform our schools so that they really are places of support, care, love, freedom, and liberation for all of our young people? And I think we can look to the school to prison pipeline, and we can look to these kinds of community-driven solutions to open up a conversation, not just about discipline and policing, but the need for the wholesale transformation of our schools towards racial equity and educational justice. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over now to Jonathan and look forward to our conversation after his presentation.
Yeah, woo, good job. So you've been working on those slides. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Jonathan Stith, and I am the National Director for the Alliance for Educational Justice and part of the National Campaign for Police-Free Schools. And just excited just to be able to talk to folks and to share some of the amazing work that I have been a part of, led by Black and Brown students, mostly high school students all across the country. As Mark kind of laid out, or I guess a little bit about myself, I grew up Cleveland, Ohio, moved to Washington, D.C. in the when was it, early 90s, and started doing work in DC public schools, trying to get young people to do community service. You go read Mark's book prior to that, Lift Us Up, Don't Push Us Out, to get that full bio piece, but was a local organizer here in DC, leading a group called the Youth Education Alliance that was part of efforts in 2006 that won the School Modernization Act that renovated most of the schools in DC public schools over the kind of last 10 or 20 years, and then got involved with the Alliance as it was forming. And as Mark laid out, kind of our mission was to try to really shift how we could change federal policy, because what we were understanding was that our victories were being limited. We couldn't change suspension policies in schools because local school administrators would tell us that it's federal policy to discriminate against Black children. And so part of the Alliance's birth is to try to challenge that, to build that narrative. I think were it didn't go far enough. We wanted legislation, but the work at the federal level did create these opportunities, as Mark talked about, these kind of local campaigns. And so the National Campaign for Police-Free Schools is actually born in that moment in 2015, as we're still kind of in the final stages of this kind of federal guidance that is going to be put out. There's this assault that happens, it is recorded, and it transforms the alliance. The young people see the recording, and instantly they start to organize across cities, organizing letter writing campaigns, particularly young people out of Miami, leading for this, supporting Naya, supporting Shakara. I think what's important about the story, as we've kind of learned it now, because part of what we couldn't understand was Shakara was also in foster care. So there was the state and its laws were what kind of protected and covered them from actually being able to tell the real story. And the story is that Shakara had an IEP, an individual education learning plan, and part of the tension with the teacher was that she requested to go see her counselor and was denied by the teacher to go see her counselor, right? And it was in that act of willful defiance, like, I'm not leaving. And so the cell phone becomes the thing where she's actually trying to reach out to her counselor. And so I think there's so many ways that, again, part of what the campaign has done is also reorientated how we understand young people's behavior and understanding our own inherent bias and criminalization of young people, particularly Black girls. And so it's also birthed out of the willful defiance of Naya, who knew this thing was going to happen, and started to organize other students in what we now understand as a cop watch or SRO watch in the classroom, and then also tried to intervene, because when the other part of the video is that Shakara is dragged off the camera screen and he continues to assault her. And so it's Naya's actual intervention and walking towards that stops this brutal assault that became then the phenomenon. And what we saw then after that was young people all across the country started to record and report these incidents using the hashtag assault at, and then adding the school name to it, beginning to challenge school board officials around the state violence that they were experiencing, demanding that there be a change, demanding officers be fired and be removed from their schools. Yet that call in that moment is not new. And I think one of the lessons that we always try to push out is that though this was a recent emergence around the call, the actual call for police out of schools existed well before the Alliance. If you look back at the high school organizing that happened in the 60s and 70s, particularly the cover of our first report, We Came to Learn, you will see high school students calling for Black studies and ethnic studies and the removal of police from their schools. And so there's also a piece around the narrative busting that we've had to do around why police are there in our schools in the first place. They're as if they're there to provide safety. That is not true. That doesn't even jive with the historical relationship of Black youth and oppressed youth to policing that, again, I think Mark talks about, that extends and connects young people's schools and the society, right? And if we, again, understand the journey of Black folk in this particular country and Indigenous folks who've been stripped of education, thrown into Native schools where they were abused. There were stories of under segregation. I'm drawing a blank on it, but there's a school there. They were like, I think dozens of Black boys locked into, who were in a boarding school, locked into it, and then it was set on fire. So this kind of the state violence is not new, and it's young people's demand for it to end is not new. But this iteration of police-free schools is in continuum of that. And again, understanding that in this country, for a young person to read, for Black folks to read, was against the law. It was criminalized. And we also understand that the average age of a runaway African slave during that time was between 13 and 29. And we know the common history of slave patrols being the modern iteration of police. So you can see, you can put those together and then put them in a school, and you have history playing itself out, this historic relationship of young people trying to learn and liberate themselves while being policed and harassed and facing state violence. And that is some of what the campaign is steeped in or rolls out of. And so the assault happens, young people start to respond. We start to build the campaign for police-free schools. Part of what we understood then was that we needed to build 3 strategies. One was this assault at, so a rapid response. So how do we help communities respond to incidents of school police violence? We started monitoring and documenting school assault acts. And you can look on, I'll drop the Police Free Schools website. You can look at it. We're currently documenting them. And I'm going to make a request later because we're actually dealing with an assault. Currently, there was one in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where a white police officer or SRO was filmed putting his neck on a Black student. And so we've been organizing rapid response and support for them. And that's been part of what we've done with the campaign, is to really say that this isn't a local problem. This isn't an incident. This is an episode. This is a part of a pattern and practice, a custom of abuse of Black and brown children happening in their schools that we have to make stop. And we all, if we're caring adults, have a responsibility to stop that and to end it. And so the second piece has been the main piece that Mark talked about, has been these kind of transformative campaigns to really end policing. And groups have put together a national strategy that consists of what we call our 7 Ds. And because as Mark has talked about, like, policing is so pervasive in our schools that just ending the contract between schools and police departments doesn't even get at it. In fact, what we understand is that we needed to really figure out how we defund police, which is what I think a lot of folks are familiar with, right? How do we shift the resources away from policing towards resources and supports for students? Groups like Labor Community Strategy Center in Los Angeles have been really phenomenal. And when I think they won like a $50 million promise that funding for police officers would go into supports for students. This idea around how do we decriminalize? How do we roll back the sets of laws that are in schools that criminalize every adolescent behavior and are particularly weaponized against Black and brown students? And so you saw that with Nia Kinney. She was charged with disturbing education. And we understand that there were many states and some of the work that the ACLU were doing was to really go after those statutes. And we need more of that, right? We, even under the pandemic, we've seen this re-stiffening of school discipline, and again with the resurgence of police. How do we deprioritize? What we know is that, and I think this is particularly important for education professionals, some school districts are calling the police on. In Oakland, they found that the schools were calling the police on students 6,000 times in 1 year, and mostly Black students. And when they looked at the data again, it was all things that in most cases, the MOU, the memorandum of understanding between the school police, the police department and the schools was violated. And that's one of the most important things around why we arrived at our position around abolition, right? This idea that, one, we cannot dismantle the school with prison pipeline without having an abolition orientation, because our schools are in fact prisons, and that this prioritization of policing response is part of a culture that needs to get dismantled. We also talk about demilitarizing, right? Looking at surveillance and metal detectors, all these worthless reforms that don't do anything but put money into other people's pockets and take resources away from our students, and allow policymakers to escape the real conversation around what it will create, what it means to create real safety in our schools. The fifth one has been about delegitimize. I've done some of that already, really getting at some of the myths, right? Police-free schools is evidence-based. It's research-based. There's no research that says police make schools any safer, stop violence, or school shootings, which are usually the excuses used for their justification. There's no research that says that. In fact, the research suggests that when you put a police officer in schools, young people are immediately criminalized, and those students are Black and brown students. Thank you for that, Mark. And then the overall one is just dismantle. And then our seventh one has been defend, because what we've learned in this moment is that winning the removal of police is not enough towards our definition of police-free schools. And when we say police-free schools, we mean dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture and practice, demilitarizing surveillance, and building towards a liberatory education. I think that's also one of the key lessons that we saw in this moment of spontaneity, in the uprisings, in the rebellions. It was very clear what people were against, but the work of doing of building the safety after school systems have failed, and which we knew they were going to be doing. And so there's a real important lesson around how do we create or understand our work in creating safety as part of creating real democracy in our schools that will then be a reflection of what we want to see in the world. And again, that's at the root of young people's work, right? It's very similar to how Ella Baker described the SNCC organizers back in the 60s when she wrote about it being bigger than a hamburger, right? It's bigger than a police-free schools. It's bigger than an officer at a school. It's bigger than a restorative justice circle. What they're really organizing and fighting for is a society that recognizes their genius in a world without police. And they believe, and I believe with them, that schools is the first site of that transformation, and that if we can win it in our schools, we can see it and fulfill it in our society. And so really excited about the piece. And then the last thing I'll do is just talk about that there's currently work happening right here in the District of Columbia around police-free schools. That we're currently working with 6 groups, Black Swan Academy in DC and their Black Youth Agenda, who's been leading amazing efforts to really push for real safety and the end of policing. Also in Alexandria with tenants and workers, who they actually won the removal of police from their schools, but in this particular moment, lost, and police have been reinstated in Alexandria, but they're still continuing to organize on. In Montgomery County, there's the Young People for Progress. There's the Montgomery County Against Brutality. Also, interestingly enough, Zakia, who now lives in the DMV region, and her organization, Racial Justice Now, has also entered a fight, which again, to me, speaks to the national nature of the work and why we had to build a national campaign, because there's no place, no school in America that a Black kid can go to, a brown kid can go to, that isn't police free. And so part of the work was to try to make that so. Also in Howard County, there's folks working out there with Defund Nova and Area, and then in PG County, PG Changemakers. So there's a robust still campaigns happening, although it's in a moment where we find the kind of moment has elapsed. We see schools hardening under the pressure, going back to what they have known all the time, is to respond to young people's crisis with violence, right? And we understand what's happening in our schools. Young people have not been together for 3 years. And in that adjustment, the system's response is not the things that they promised them: more health counselors, more guidance counselors, more supports. Their response has been more policing. And so for us, that's why we arrive again at that position of abolition, that we have to end policing in our schools. There is no other way. We've tried all the reforms. You can name them and drop them in the chat. I'll tell you a campaign that we won around it and how it didn't work. And that's why, again, we're at that position. So I encourage folks to follow the Police Free Schools website. I'll drop the link for Kenosha. I think part of national solidarity helps folks realize that they're not fighting alone, and that there is a set of folks who are with them, who are showing solidarity and support. So I'll stop there, and I guess I'll turn it back over to. Who I turn it back over to?
Lionel, I think.
I'll take over. Thank you so much, Mark and Jonathan. I think you've given us a lot to consider. I should turn my video on. You've given us a lot to consider, and certainly I'm sure there are many questions from the participants. Let me just, for our guests who are joining us, if you do have questions, you can place them in the chat, and we'll work our way through those questions as our time allows. But I want to start and take the privilege of asking the first couple of questions to our guest. And I just want to highlight a couple of things that was shared this evening. One, the history that Mark has presented to us. It's so critically important to just help frame the issues, but also to help us understand what the trajectory has been and what opportunities and what gains have been made in addressing these issues. And then sort of it was a nice ending that Jonathan offered us about what's happening in the contemporary, and especially as it relates to what feels like some local efforts in the greater DMV area. And so my question actually comes through Jonathan's presentation. And I have been thinking a lot about what's happening locally. And so I've been loosely following the conversations in Montgomery County Public Schools, Arlington County Schools around school resource officers. And one of the things that I noted in some of the conversations was something you also mentioned, this sort of regressing back to old ways of doing, right? And so as we move school resource officers out of schools, the reintroduction of them back into school systems, but sometimes a reintroduction in a different way. So they offer a new label for these policing efforts, these surveilling efforts, perhaps moving them out of the physical school building, but still nonetheless a part of a system that's policing students. And so I'm curious to know what's your perspective around this sort of reframing potentially of these ideas, but also what are your thoughts about the organizing that seems to be happening for people who actually want to bring back school resource officers, and the ways in which that may be creating interesting tensions in the work that you are taking up? Mark, are you sharing your screen?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Am I?
I don't see you sharing your screen.
Okay. Sorry.
No.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, that was a remind me the first part, and then I think I'll catch the second.
Yeah, so this reframing of
Oh, right.
school
Yes. I got you. Okay. So we call it police falk schools, because these are a set of what we've seen and what we understand. I think when you kind of read the arc of all of Mark's work, is that one of the things that we're learning is that the system will adjust, or it will adapt, or find new ways to do policing. And that the work of transformation is really hard. And when we started out to this work in 2015 and started to build the campaign, we imagined a decade-long struggle to actually reach police-free schools. We thought that, and so what happened with George Floyd opened a real portal for folks. But as Mark talked about, those who were organized were ready to take advantage of it. And still, it was really embedded, right? Like not everybody was moved around that. So I think it's really important to see that. We see that like in places like Montgomery County, where they've introduced a CEO program instead of calling them their community engagement officers, right? And what we were hearing from students is that they actually were in violation of the thing. They weren't supposed to be in the hallways. They were actually in the hallways. So again, for us, it's like there's this way that police are not accountable to the systems or to the agreements that we pretend them to be or try to sell us to. And so we saw that again in Alexandria, when after they reinstated the police, they reinstated police after not getting young people the mental health counselors and supports that they were promised, right? So there's this way, again, that we've seen local systems fail to meet students' demands around mental health supports. And again, I think what's the long arc of that is that when we go back to Stoneman Douglas, and that fight there, right? Those young people also, they called for mental health supports over policing, right? And so there's this way that, again, in the space of school shootings, young people are like, no, actually, we want a different response. And it's the same in the DMV, but they're getting met with the same response. I think there's also, we believe that part of what we're experiencing also is a right-wing backlash that has also been started to localize. And so we see the connections. It's the same parents that are calling, rallying against critical race theory, which never existed in schools. I just want to tell all of y'all that that has never been taught in none of the high schools. linking that to the calls for policing. And I think what it reveals is, again, the racial nature of it, that I think sometimes when we talk about young people, we talk about it as if young people don't have a race, right? And young people do have a race, and police treat our young people differently. And so when we're hearing that, we know who the parents are. And oftentimes, like in Alexandria, they'll say that, they out-organize those parents, but the school system, as we've seen in the past, only seems to be responsive to white parents. And so I think that's some of the dynamic there. So there is this kind of orientation and softening of police that we have to be very careful around. I think Indiana is another school district. They're lauding some changes that they've done, but it's the same policing, right? And it had the same results like we won around suspension data. So under the Obama administration, we won these reform. What we saw was the number of suspensions go down, but the racial disparity, the ratio stayed the same. And we're seeing the same thing with policing. And so it just speaks to, again, the racist nature of education and path to transform.
Right. And I was thinking about too, just the policing of students in schools, this discussion about the false representation of CRT in schools, and these debates taking up in school board meetings, right? And people having opportunity to sort of weigh on both sides or multiple sides of this conversation. And so when I was reading about parents organizing in support of SROs, it offers us an interesting sort of conversation, right? So all the work that your community, the folks you've worked with are taking up, are arguing the opposite of this effort. And so school boards are left sometimes with a stalemate of ideas or perspectives. So if you could offer us perspective on if you had to engage or when you've engaged school boards around these issues, what are some of the things that you've tried to offer them as points of understanding? I appreciated the different parts of the plan you laid out, but was there anything specific to that was presented to like school boards or those sort of oversight bodies?
I think it was the student voice and student demand. I think, again, like the uprisings, again, just created a groundswell that was already growing for students. So yeah. I'm sorry, someone speaking.
That was Mark. I was just going to add to that really, what I found a lot in interviewing policymakers as well, and school board members or state legislatures, is just the power of hearing the direct experiences of young people from their own mouths. Yes, mobilizing a lot of people is powerful, but so are young people who speak and say, police don't make us feel safe, actually. Police make us feel afraid. And, recounting experiences that they have had with police or their friends have had with police, and wanting, wanting a different kind of a school and a different kind of supports. And I think that's part of the problem, is that, removing police from schools needs to be the start of the conversation, not the end of the conversation. And so unless we carry through and really start to invest in support systems for young people, and more broadly in our school systems, then when incidents of fights are going to break out, that particularly when kids are traumatized by a pandemic and by loss in their families, by illness, by remote learning, it's going to cause disruption. So but the answer, can't be, well, let's scare everybody into feeling like we need to bring police back, or scaring parents, I think, is part of what happens too, right? And there's this disconnect between parents' experience of police in the community and sometimes their support for police in schools. Like, why should you think it should be any different? But, parents are afraid for their kids. And if there aren't going to be alternatives that really are put in place, then, it creates that kind of condition. So I think what's been argued is, investing, like some of the studies, just to show you a few statistics, there are 1.7 million students attend schools with police officers, but no counselors. At one point, 3 million students attend schools with police officers, but no nurses. 10 million students attend schools with police officers, but no social workers. So, we have invested in these policing systems, and what we haven't invested in is the kinds of support structures that, our young people need.
Yeah. And, I was just reflecting on Jonathan's last point and also your point about the voices of young people. And embedded in this, in full transparency, I train as a developmental psychologist, and I think about schools as a context for development, right? Identity development, specifically for race and gender. But I think how we construct the notion of youth or young people, right? And sometimes our inability to see them as actual change agents and sort of being fully aware of what they need, right? And sometimes we adults can privilege our adult status as being a better determiner of what is needed for them. So we don't sort of honor their voices in ways that privilege that they can know what they need and they can tell us what they need. And so when we have young people participating in these organizing efforts, making very clear what they would like to see in place, we ought to be listening, right? We ought to be paying attention to that. But I think sometimes we can step into our full adult selves and lose the capacity to really hear those voices in ways that could be quite instrumental and instructive for what probably should be happening in schools. And that may also go back to how we think about sort of the relationship between adults and youth in general, even outside the school context, right?
Yeah, I agree with your point around schools as the site of development. I think that has all been underneath the campaign, and again, the work of young folk. Like, they understand, like, at this stage of their lives, right, they are constructing themselves and the world. And so police-free schools becomes that piece of construction of the world that they want to see. And I do think that, this way that, again, our young people get ignored, their needs get ignored, their visions of themselves get ignored. And so they have to come together and begin to organize and really push school districts to really to really devise a means, as Ella Baker talks about, devise a means to transform a system to help it meet your needs, which is what a lot of the strategies that young people are up to, both in kind of organizing, but also just navigating the school system.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So there's a question in the chat, and hopefully I get this question correct, offered by one of our participants. The question is there any intersectionality between this topic and the lowering of the voting age? Over some exercise. Alicia James, can you please mute yourself?
Is there a connection? Well, I think there's a couple points of connection. I mean, first of all, let me also say that a lot of the young people who are organizing around police-free schools are often organizing from an intersectional perspective, that, all these issues are connected in their lives. So if they're, immigrant young people, they're talking not just about school policing, but the deportation pipeline and the criminalization also of their parents. A lot of young people involved in this movement also care deeply about environmental justice issues and are organizing around that, and are also very heavily involved with registering people to vote. And so, because it's really an understanding of the systems of oppression, we organize often around single issues, but as we know, people don't live single issue lives. And so the broader issue, I think, is how do communities, particularly low-income communities of color, build the power necessary to really address these intersecting issues. And so part of that question is struggles over voting rights, not just for young people, but for Black people in this country and for others, right? So I think there have been specific campaigns by young people and youth organizing groups to lower the voting age. whether that's often in municipal elections or for school board elections, because this is, again, young people asserting that, we need to have the right and to have a say over what happens in our own educational systems. We're not just, future adults in developmental stages. We are full human beings at this moment in our lives and have the direct experience. We are closest to what is happening in schools and in some ways what's happening in our communities, and we have a legitimate authority and should have it, and that can be also expressed through having the right to vote at a younger age.
Yeah, that's exactly what the participant was getting at, sort of thinking of the ways in which youth voices get heard, and it may actually be through giving them a vote, right? So rather than relying on adults who don't often represent their interests, they now have an opportunity to register their interests, their concerns. And there was a comment that both you and Jonathan are an anomaly in sorts, that you have certainly created space for raising of the voices of young people. There's another question
on the connection, because there was some concrete places. So I think when you look at Oakland and look what the Black Organizing Project won, you also want to look at Oakland Kids First, who also won the right for young people to vote on school boards. And I think it was an early trying development that we were trying to build, but did not really fully form it. Black Swan Academy at the time, they were also doing these kind of things around elected officials. Trying to get a vote. And so I think that one, it is a move, and what we saw in some of the campaigns was that it was actually the youth school board member who was introducing the resolution around removing police from school. So I think that was part of, going back to your kind of first question too, like that was an unsaid part of the campaign that we have yet to lift up, that it was those reps, oftentimes non-voting members, right, on the school boards. The other issue connected to this is also for many Black and brown communities, particularly where we're organized, they have been stripped of their right to elect their school board officials through mayoral control and privatization. So big cities like New York, right? Like the young people don't have access to that because their communities, parents have been stripped of that. And so I think there's always been this other undeveloped part of our work that does have to look at why these communities don't have power, how that lack of power and ability to control the education of their children leads to their over-policing, the under-resourcing, and the transformation of the schools into prisons. And I do think part of the remedy is giving young people more power to decide things in the school system as part of this practice of democracy, right? Because that's what we're developing. Are we developing citizens, or are we developing slaves? And I think that is the question that we're always asking when we're interrogating education practices.
Yeah, and I was thinking, like, oftentimes we'll have that one seat on the scoreboard for a student rep, right? And that lone voice in some ways is just perfunctory, right? It's just there. There was a question.
Non-voting, often non-voting seat.
That's right. And so it's more symbolic than anything substantive, right? There was a question in the chat that asked whether or not the research also looks at school culture as well as bullying within schools. Does your work take up those constructs?
Yes. Well, so this whole question of bullying, and Jonathan, you can also talk about this, and we covered it in the book. A number of years ago, part of the development of the movement was the role of the Genders and Sexuality Alliance Network, GSA network. People know them more as the GSA clubs. They're kind of the more national political arm of this movement, really. And, there were various incidents, and the Obama administration was talking about zero tolerance around bullying. And the GSA network, and I think Alliance for Educational Justice was a partner in this, and Advancement Project was saying, no, actually, anti-bullying policies aren't the answer to, zero tolerance around bullying is not the answer, because what often happens is zero tolerance is a blanket kind of policy. So if a LGBTQ student is being, harassed over a period of time and finally fights back, well, they're suspended for fighting. That's zero tolerance. And secondly, And that happens in a widespread way. And secondly, suspending students for bullying others doesn't actually get at the root cause of anything. It doesn't change anything. And so when that student comes back, he still could be he or she could still be a bullying, or even worse. So really the answer is not zero tolerance towards bullying, but trying to think in a more restorative practices, which are trying to, work with young people around the causes of this. And by the way, it's not only just students bullying other students. I mean, a lot of our school systems have bullied or repressed LGBTQ students, gender nonconforming students, right? So it's a system. And in fact, SROs are known for harassing gender nonconforming students in particular ways too. So it's really, bullying is a real issue, but bullying happens by adults as well as students towards other students. And, I think our argument is the answer is, along the lines of, our opposition to zero tolerance. We're really trying to transform the culture of schools into a culture of respect. And that has to start with the educators and the adults in the school. Because I think part of the problem is often restorative justice is seen as just it's a different way of dealing with student misbehavior. And, so if students fight, don't expel them or don't suspend them, have a restorative circle. Yes. But the main issue is the adults have set up a system in the school that is set up to punish and control and discipline and criminalize young people. And I think a lot of teachers, when they first get involved in really authentic restorative justice, have to, realize it's really about them. They need to be restored, their approach to what they're doing in their classroom and how they're relating to students and families is really what has to change. And I think adults have to take the leadership in the school, and then also obviously work with young people as part of that process.
Yeah, thank you for that last part. Some of my more recent work is looking at the social emotional learning and development of Black boys, and SEL has been a hot topic for some time now, but oftentimes that research is locating the problem within the child. Right. And so I'm suggesting that we need to be looking at the educational ecosystem and the ways in which the adults are sort of creating and directly influence how SEL has happened and experienced by Black boys in particular, that can lead to suspensions in third grade, right? And so trying to begin to understand how we might reframe our understanding about SEL and how we sort of frame the issue, or quote unquote the problem. Yeah. So thinking about those kinds of areas as well. I think there's another question from my colleague co-host.
Yes, hi, thank y'all so much. I'm glad you took the conversation where you did. You changed my question 3 times as you were talking. There's so many things I want to ask, but I want to sort of continue on this line of like, what are some of the root causes, right? In this idea of what sort of prompts us to default back to a culture of criminalization and punishment, right? And we know that, obviously racist ideas, oppressive ideas, right, that sort of animate, our school systems in all ways are one of those things. But I'm curious, like, how would you identify in your work, what are some of those other root causes around, like, what do we have stuck in our minds as people who are a part of education systems, right? Inside or outside of them, that prevent us from being able to adopt a true restorative mindset to how we think about our communities, right? What it is that we're doing in school. So I'm curious, like, can you help us sort of unpack and dislodge some of those ideas, I think, that trap us and continue this cycle of criminalization and the rationale, the justification for it, right? That allows this stuff to perpetuate.
Sure. Should I go first on that one?
Yeah, you go first.
I mean, I think, you're right. We're operating today, and educators, if that's what we're talking about, are operating today, but it's part of the larger society, in the context of 400 years of white supremacy, right? And so in the 90s, a narrative was developed of the super predator that really, characterized particularly young Black boys, young men, and brown boys and young men as predators, as potential criminals. And that was brought into our schools, and it was very deep seated, and it resonated because it was a narrative that has its roots going back 400 years, but had it also its particular, narrative in the current era. And I think that the really taking a look at, for educators, what are really our attitudes? Why do we perceive Black boys in third grade as threats when they're jumping around a classroom as boys will do? How is that seen as threatening or disruptive? So, and really, addressing these kinds of stereotypes. And there's a set also for Black girls as well, right? And so that are also historically developed and then resonate today. So I think it's a lot of deep work, and all of us have been raised in this system. So I think it's and both in our educational system and our broader media culture, and just to recognize how deep-seated these things are. And I think I try to talk about, like, we're talking about, this is a systemic issue. So we need systemic change. We actually have to change policies. We have to remove police from schools. We have to end suspensions for willful defiance. But there are particular people who have been carrying out these policies. And, so it's a systemic, but it's also an individual matter. And if we're really going to create change, we have to change our systems, but we have to change our individuals. And, part of changing our individuals is coming to terms with the kinds of deep-seated biases and assumptions that are made, and for educators to ask, even at various points, to say, am I acting now in a way that is promoting and sustaining a school to prison pipeline or dismantling it? When I perceive this young Black child in front of me doing something, would I react the same way if it was a white child who was doing the same thing? And I think these are the kinds of questions that people need to ask themselves. And I will say one other thing, which I think gets at the ultimate part of the society's, value. Do we really value and respect Black families and brown families in this country? Because I think for so many Black children, the whole setup is telling them from day one, we're not really valued here. And these are really fundamental questions. Who's valued? And I'll just give an example. My wife, as Mandy and Lionel and Jonathan know, is a teacher in Boston Public Schools. She teaches pre-K, and I learn about the realities of the school to prison pipeline from her every day. She taught at a school where for the pre-K section of the school, the boys' bathroom was broken and there was urine on the floor throughout the entire year. And so, these poor Black children had to go in, if they wanted to go to the bathroom, they had to go into a bathroom where the floor was covered with urine, and it wasn't fixed for the entire year. And you ask yourself, how can this possibly happen? And in a place like Boston, which is supposed to be one of the best big city schools, and it's a statement about what the core value is of Black children. And I think we have to deal with that as individuals and as a society and in our institutions.
Thank you so much for that response, Mark. We are unfortunately nearing the end of our time together. We have about 5 minutes left. And so I want to just create an opportunity if there's any sort of closing thoughts or perspectives either you or Jonathan would like to share with us, and invite you to do so at this moment.
I guess I'll kick us off. One, I want to thank everybody for engaging, asking the questions, thinking with us. I think, again, to Mark's earlier point, like, I can remember a time when we would go to places and talk about a school to prison pipeline, and we would get booed out of places. I can remember conversations around removing police from schools where we were told it was a impossibility. So to discuss the possibility of it, I think is always just really profound. To share the stories of young people in their organizing always feels like a really deep honor. And I think as y'all are opened up and talked about kind of this commitment of this work that y'all are in around kind of dismantling these systems of oppression and exploitation, schools are a major site of that. And I think part of what the invitation is and why we have chosen abolition as an ideology is because that is exactly what it's intended to do, to just end these systems of oppression and exploitation. And what we love about abolition is that it's an intersectional, intergenerational, international project that we all can play a role in, that we all can contribute to. And so our invitation is that when we say follow young people to police-free schools, absolutely, and bring something and help out, sign the petition. Every little action helps. It all matters, and it all helps towards creating a movement needed to really transform our schools, our society, and the world. So I thank y'all for being in it with us, and I hope that this was useful for whatever you're moving towards in your life as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Maybe you could drop in the chat how people can get involved, if there are ways that you might suggest with your work, please. Mark, please go ahead.
Sure. I'll just say that again, thank you for being with us, and thank you for everyone who joined the call. I think that speaking as a white person, I think we all have a really deep responsibility to address the school to prison pipeline. There are really two educational systems in this country, and a lot of people in whiter, more affluent communities have no idea what is going on in schools serving, supposedly serving low-income Black and brown families. And yet what we have to also grapple with is that school to prison pipeline is really what's really buttressing the system that's providing privilege to others. These things are connected. We have two systems of education that are actually intimately connected with each other. And if we really have an interest in living in a society where, that offers the chance for really full and free development of all our human beings and the chance for education liberation, then we all have to take that stand and take some action. And as I was saying before, ask ourselves, are the actions that we're taking, supporting and sustaining this system, or really acting to work to dismantle it and to reach out and follow the lead of young people, partner with young people, partner with their families, move away from these kind of deep-seated deficit notions. And, I was very clear that I started the book with Zakia's story because we have to understand the experiences that families are having, but we can't see them only as victims because they're not only as victims. Parents like Zakia and young people that Jonathan and others work with, are also, emerging as change makers and organizers, and they give us hope. This is where the hope really lies, I think, for, a different kind of society for all of us. And I have always felt deeply welcomed into this movement, because I think, at least in part, because I reach out to form a real partnership. And I try to work out of respect and partnership, not that I'm here as a college professor, or someone who's an expert with all the answers. And I think that's the way that it points a way that other kinds of educators can think about how they can reach out and partner with, and as Jonathan's saying, follow the leadership of us to a different kind of school and different kind of society. So thank you. I think you're muted, Lionel.
Thank you, Mark, for those closing comments and thoughts. And I'm going to just encourage you to, again, drop in the chat how folks can access your book. I believe your publishers are offering a very generous discount. And so I'm going to encourage our guests to get the book so you can learn and read more. And before I offer closing remarks, I'm going to invite my colleague, co-host, Dr. Taylor from American University, to say a few words if she'd like.
Thank you. Thank you for the work. Thank you for the inspiration and the passion that you bring to this always. You've energized me. I'm leaving here feeling more committed than ever. And I think that energy, I would guess, is shared among all of us. So thank you.
And finally, I just offer my sincere thanks to both Jonathan and Mark for making time to spend the evening with us. I too feel sufficiently full, and I have questions, which is always a good thing. It keeps me going in this work. And I want to thank our guests for spending time with us as well this evening. I know you have many opportunities and options for how you spend your time, so hopefully this was a worthy endeavor. I'm also going to invite everyone to keep an eye out for our next presentation that's a part of our colloquial series. On April 27th, we will be having a presentation by Adam Sawyer, who is located at Cal State University, Bakersfield. And he will be sharing his research that explores the nexus of migration and education with the focus on Latinx children, youth, and families. So stay tuned for that wonderfully rich conversation. So thank you all. Have a good evening. Be safe. Take care.